This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Hi there. Welcome to our next episode of Finding Intimacy with God, Psalm by Psalm. We're in week 7. We're going to be looking at Psalm 25 today, at least part of that psalm. We're not going to look at the whole thing, but some of the verses there. The name of this one, and what we're going to be looking at, is In the Middle of Fear. Now, I want to make a clarification right quick. I'm not talking about fearing a situation. I'm talking about our reverential fear of God. And what does that look like? And you know, when you talk about intimacy and fear, that feels like that's not the same thing. So why does my intimate relationship with God depend on my reverential fear of God or for God? And so I want to explain that, because I think David gives us a good rendition of that in Psalm 25. Because, you know, for me, intimacy with God often would be that I need to know Him well enough and understand what He tells me. And I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We in our looking for intimacy, understanding when we hear God, we often think that we're going to hear all these booming voices, or we're going to have all this clear direction or whatever. That's not necessarily the case. And I shouldn't even say it's not necessarily the case. I think it's absolutely not the case. We feel like if I know God intimately, then I'm going to be able to understand His voice. I'm going to be able to hear Him. And yes, you know, I'm not going to say that God doesn't speak to us in visions. He has spoken to me in visions. That He doesn't. You don't hear audible voices. Although I don't think besides Moses, I'm not sure how many people have actually audibly heard the voice of God. But He can do whatever He wants to do. I mean, if He chooses to do that, of course, I'm not going to say He can't do it. But what I will tell you is that God doesn't necessarily. And I found this great quote by John Piper, and I want to give it to you in a minute. It is the development of your spiritual sensitivity. God is, the normal mode for God guiding us is the development of our spiritual sensitivity. Now, by that I mean He is going to make you more sensitive and more able to, within your spirit, discern His voice. And that development of that takes trials, tribulations, it takes things for you, and it takes you studying the Word. John Piper said it this. He said, the prerequisite of divine guidance is not the quest for messages, but the quest for holiness. So let me stop and say that again. It is I have so many people come to me. How do I know I'm hearing the voice of God? What do I need? There are so many books written out there, hearing the voice of God, knowing the voice of God, and discerning the voice of God. There are so many of them to tell you how to hear God's voice. And I think that all those books are well-meaning, and there are great tools, but it's not really about getting a message from God. Being able to hear God's voice is really training in spiritual sensitivity, becoming more holy. And remember, holy, we've talked about this a lot in past studies. Holiness doesn't mean perfection. Holiness means set apartness. It means being more Christ-like, being set apart from this world. The holier you are, that quest for being more like Christ makes you more spiritually sensitive. And so therefore, then that's when you hear God's voice. It's not looking for messages, it's looking for holiness. I love the way he says that. He goes on to say, guidance is the product not of ecstatic heights, but of spiritual depth. That's so well stated, because that we need to set our sights on something different than what we've set our sights on. We have set our sights often on the spiritual ecstasy of, I got a message from God, I got a vision, I heard a prophetic word, all those things. And they're wonderful and they happen. But instead of our looking for those ecstatic heights of messages from God, we should be looking for the spiritual depth of holiness and being Christ-like, because in that we become more spiritually sensitive and we know God's voice. You know it when He speaks to you because you have moved in that spiritual depth. So what does that have to do with fear? Well, the thing is that you can't have a quest for holiness if you don't understand that God is holy, and that your quest to be in the likeness of Christ, the likeness of God, is a quest for that perfect holiness. And that the fear I'm talking about here is a reverential knowledge, not a trembling, I'm scared of them. That's not the fear. The fear is I have a reverential knowledge of who my Father is. And in that, then you can build intimacy because you know him. As I've said before, it's difficult to depend on a God you don't trust. If you don't think he is God, then why would you trust him to get you out of this problem? Or if you don't think he is strong and sovereign and amazing, then you wouldn't trust him to be your refuge. He wouldn't be the one you want to go to. It's that reverential knowledge of who he is that then brings you into that intimate relationship with him. It's knowing him. Again, it goes right back to knowing him. And to know God is to have a godly fear of him. And please lose the idea that fear is what we in our 20th century, 21st century minds have made fear. Fear is what we have decided frightens us. When and the truth of the matter in the way that this is used, the biblical term for fear is a reverential knowledge. It's an awe. It's a holding as holy, set apart. He is God, and I see that, so I hold reverence for that, and that's the fear of God. It's not I'm afraid he'll strike me dead. It's I see how big and amazing he is. That's the fear of God, and you have to have that in order to have an actual intimate relationship with him. So David, he knows this. In Psalm 25, David is, having another bad time. David was having lots of bad times. So he's having a bad time, and he knows that the way he's going to get comfort from God, the way he's going to get comfort from his intimate relationship with God is to understand the fear of God. And how do you know who God is? He knows how that happens too. If you're in in Psalm 25, look at verses 4 and 5. And David knows what it takes. Verses 4 and 5 say, "Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long." David knows what it takes. He says, let me know your word. Let me know your way. Because when I know your way, I know you. And therefore, when I know you, I have reverential fear of you. And when I have that reverential fear, that knowledge of who you are, I can trust you. I trust you to be there with me. That's that intimacy that we seek. So the verses I want to look at here are just verses 8 through 14 in chapter 25. So in Psalm 25, let me read those in their entirety first. Psalm 25, verses 8 through 14. "Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to them his covenant." Again, I stress, and I'll stress it over and over again, do not read those verses as if David is saying friendship of the Lord is for those who are scared to death of him, because that's not much of friendship, is it? That's not what he's saying. He's saying friendship from the Lord comes from those who know who he is and stand in reverential awe of the greatness of who he is. That's what David is saying, and that's the meaning of that word fear as it's used and pertains to the Lord. So there's a couple of things I think that David speaks to here that lets us know how we can develop that reverential awe and what it requires for you and I to have that so that we can then have that intimacy. And the first one is that it's got to be those of us who see our own sin. You can't pass by your sin and just put it off on the wayside and say, well, that was in the past. That just happened over there. And God, God forgave me and we're good over here. You see your sin. You live in a state of sadness over your sin. It doesn't mean that you carry around condemnation, but you definitely carry around the conviction, and you see your sin. Verse 8 says, "Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way." Knowing that we're sinners in the sight of God is truly a way to stand in reverential awe of who he is. The second one is he says those who are humble. Verse 9 says he leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. Charles Spurgeon said this, "Meek spirits are in high favor with the Father. They know their need of guidance and are willing to submit their understandings to divine will, and therefore the Lord condescends to be their guide. Again, you have that reverential awe of who God is. You can only really have that if you know who you are. and that requires you seeing that you're a sinner and that you're humble about who you are. The next thing I see is that it's those who are obedient. Those who are going to know God in this way, David says they're the ones who are obedient to what God says. Verse 10 says, all the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. Knowing that we're sinners is one, making sure that we're humble about that. But it's also, it's kind of like I was telling my son many, many years ago. He was, talking about how he didn't feel like God was guiding him. God's too far away, doesn't hear him. And my exact words to him were, don't expect to hear God clearly if you are living disobediently. And that's because you haven't recognized your sin, you're not humble in that, and you have not at all sought God in terms of the truth of who you are. We have to be obedient. You want to hear it? You can't live like the world and then go back and think you're going to be able to hear God. You're clogging up the pipelines to heaven, man. Your sin clogs up those pipelines. And so David's saying the persons who are going to live happy are the ones who are obedient, because otherwise you're not going to know him. You can't even hear him that way. So I'll tell you what I told my son, don't expect to hear God clearly if you're living disobediently. The pipeline's clogged up. The fourth thing is that David says that people who will know God are going to fear God. Now, this is the crux of the matter, and this is the one I really wanted to end on. First, we got to remember that fearing God, again, is not being afraid of him. Fearing God is that reverential awe. And unless we understand that he can help us, how can we then trust him in that? I mean, if you don't know that he can, how do you know that he will? That doesn't even make good sense, does it? So you have to stand in awe of who he is, understanding this is a God of the universe. He can help me. And because I know that he can, I can believe that he will. This is so instrumental in our understanding that. And don't miss the intensity of that truth in verse 12. It says, who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way he should choose. Basically, David's saying, you fear God, you're going to hear God. and it's pretty simple. I've gotten to the point where now when people come to me and say, because I use that verbiage all the time. I heard God tell me, God told me this, God told me that. And that can be misleading sometimes. Sometimes it sounds like I'm saying God actually spoke to me. And more often than not, again, I do believe I hear him speak to me, but it's not his voice, it's mine in my head. How do I discern that? Well, I discern that because I know and I fear my Father. I know who he is. And because I know him, I can discern his voice. And it's definitely not mine. It may sound like me, but I don't say that stuff. And it may sound, and the enemy can talk in my head too, but he doesn't sound anything like God, even though they all have my voice. It's all, when you hear voices in your head, you're hearing your own voice. But it'll be different people that you're hearing through that filter of your voice. And is it God or is it Satan? If you know God, you'll know when it's him. And to fear him is to know him. To fear the Lord, those are the ones that David says will receive his instruction. And that will hear it and understand it. And I stress, it's not being afraid of him. It is knowing who he is. I go back to that phrase, I will know that God will help me when I understand that he can. And I don't think many of us recognize the value in that. In understanding that if I understand who he is, then I'll understand that he can, and then I'll know that he will. And then you hear his voice. So in conclusion, I think there's a couple of questions. Does fearing God connect to knowing him intimately? Well, yes. The latter can't exist without the former. You cannot have an intimate relationship with God and know him if you don't fear him. And by that means knowing him intimately. And to whom does God offer his guidance? Well, David pretty clearly says it's those who submit to him, those who seek him, those who obey him, those who fear him, and those who see themselves as who they actually are, the humble. Those are the people who can expect to hear from God. And you can. You can and you will. And he's talking to you all the time. God is directing you all the time. Do you hear him? Can you distinguish him? That's not about him not talking to you. It's about you putting yourself in a position of understanding and hearing him. It's not that God talks to me more than he does you, or he talks to some other pastor that I hold in high regard more than he does me. He doesn't talk to anybody more than somebody else. It's whether or not you understand and can discern his voice, and that's up to you. That's up to what you do. Are you humble? Do you see your own sin? Do you fear God? Are you obedient? If you are all those things, then you're going to hear him speak to you. You'll discern that. It's not that he's not, it's that you don't discern it. And if you do discern it, it's because you are aware that you're a sinner. You are humble about who you are. You do fear the Lord. You are obedient. And because you are those things, then you begin to be able to discern his voice. There's no trickery here. There's no favoritism. God makes it very clear in the book of James, he doesn't show partiality. We do that. He doesn't do that. There's not somebody that you see as some big, huge high pastor that has more access to God than you do. We all have equal access to our Father. He doesn't love one of us more than he does the other one, and he doesn't talk to one more than he does the other. It's just one may be able to hear him better, and that is totally in your court. Let me stress again, if you haven't done so, download the PDFs. The videos are also available for download at debwaterbury.com under the Finding Intimacy with God Bible study. I pray for y'all. I pray that you're praying for me. This is not easy stuff, but the ball is in our court. He's talking to you. He's talking to me. Do you hear him? You can make sure that you do. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.